If you've got a long-running franchise on your hands, there's a good chance you'll churn out a black sheep every now and then, an entry that wasn't as critically well received or sometimes outright panned. Exactly how this happens can boil down to a number of factors: a lack of budget, loss of focus, aiming too high, a rushed development cycle, handing it off to a less experienced studio. Maybe your mind goes to Silent Hill Downpour, Sonic Boom Rise of Lyric, Mega Man X7.
Gotta play this game, dude. It's friggin' cool.
There are a number of misfires out there, and recovering from them is definitely an uphill battle. In Tenchu's case, Fatal Shadows certainly wasn't the worst received game in the series. That honor goes to Tenchu Dark Secret, and may we never utter its name again. But the fourth entry into the series did get a lot of flack from reviewers. It was an entry that saw the series plateau, offered very little new, and felt like more of an expansion than the next design leap forward in the stealth genre. On the whole, I agree with the majority of the criticisms out there. When I played the game upon release nearly 20 years ago, something had flown right over my head. It wasn't until I revisited the game that I saw it. There's something wrong with Fatal Shadows. It didn't sit right with me. So I started digging a little until it suddenly became clearer. Then, the reason Fatal Shadows is the way it is, for better and for worse, suddenly made total sense. But before I drink the Kool-Aid while trying to affix my tinfoil hat, let's start with a high-level takeaway. Fatal Shadows features some of the best level design from a pure enemy layout perspective. We can thank the reduced scope for that, but there was clear growth from K2 in terms of understanding the elements that make an interesting challenge for the player. Special moves and items have seen some refinement, with a focus on providing more agency in how you choose to either engage or avoid environmental threats. However, the game's biggest failing is its combat. A number of fights feel outright broken, particularly late game bosses, making items all but mandatory. Its narrative feels more concrete than Wrath of Heaven, but neither characters nor plot lines are given enough time to breathe in order to become compelling. Likewise, its reduced budget and overall scope, while making those aforementioned engaging stages, creates uninspired and plain locales from a purely aesthetic standpoint. In short, Fatal Shadows is a game that is a step up in core stealth mechanics, but is a step down in terms of presentation and combat mechanics. If we were to formulate some kind of ranking between the games, it'd look like this. Fatal Shadows provides the best mechanical stealth challenge. Birth of the Stealth Assassins still takes the top spot in terms of narrative. Wrath of Heaven boasts some of the best level design, and Stealth Assassins acts more as the middle ground between the four releases. Well, we'll dive into the meat of all those points when running through Fatal Shadows. Let's first take a look at the game's critical reception. Of the PS2 and PS1 releases from the Tenchu franchise, we do not speak of some other platforms. Fatal Shadows found the most mixed reviews. On Metacritic, it sits at a score of 58, the lowest when taking into account mainline entries up to that point. I think it's important to look briefly at the reviews first, because there's some context to consider in just how the game was made, which may clear up some of the reviewers' major issues. Electronic Gaming Monthly issue 189 furnished Fatal Shadows with an average score right down the middle with a 5. Ford, Brian and Sean managed to encapsulate in a few hundred words what has taken me around 18,000. Unfortunately, a number of flaws kill the game's flow, namely a particularly atrocious camera, a weak lock-on system, a frustrating lack of checkpoints, and poor enemy AI. Honestly, can't argue with that assessment. There's still praise for the flashy stealth kills and 70s samurai show presentation, but it's not enough to propel the game's score over average. The sense of the crowd goes mild continues with Game Informer 143. Matt and Andy had the same gripes about the formula lacking any engaging evolution, such as other heavy stealth hitters at the time, Splinter Cell and MGS. Again, you'll get no argument from me on that front. All I'll say is there's a reason Fatal Shadows feels like a side story rather than a mainline entry. We'll get to that soon enough. Another interesting time capsule is in MCV, Market for Computer and Video Games, which was a trade-focused magazine for the industry. Firstly, they highlighted the Skip Doctor, which was supposed to repair scratched CDs. I actually had this thing and it was useless, like a cloth would have done a decent enough job. Secondly, if we look at the charts at the time, Fatal Shadows came in at number 17 behind the likes of Final Fantasy VII on the PS1, TT Superbikes on the PS2, and Star Wars Episode 3 Revenge of the Sith. Now, not that it's a particular indicator for sales, Half-Life 2 is on that list and the game did alright, I think. According to the video game sales data I dug up for another video, and take that with a pinch of salt, Fatal Shadows allegedly sold 190,000 copies. That's a fair distance from Wrath of Heaven's combined sales on Xbox and PS2, which totaled 1,350,000. Again, it may not be accurate, but that's quite a drop if true. The official PlayStation magazine gave Fatal Shadows 2 out of 5. One quote in particular seems eerily relevant. Even if you are able to miraculously overcome the camera handicap, the game's dated graphics engine looks like, at best, a PSP title, and at worst, like a sharper version of its PS1 counterpart. Finally, if we just handpick a couple of reviews from each end of the spectrum, we can look at Silicon Era and Game Revolution. Both these sites are still going, by the way, in one form or another. As always, reviews from that period, especially online, were always a bit of a Wild West. The unnamed reviewer over at Silicon Era says, and I quote, "Even though it may not be the most visually appealing game, Tenchu Kurenai has more of what Tenchu fans come to love. Fans of the series and stealth games will get a kick out of its larger stages." Unfortunately, the article does make a few amusing mistakes, calling Ayame Ayane and the previous game Wraith of Heaven. I think given the time of the review and the fact that it states the game wasn't out in the US yet, they probably played a Japanese copy. However, I don't think they're Japanese because you pronounce Ayame's name the same in Japanese. It's not like it was Romanized or anything like that. Don't want to rag on them too much. The editor, if they even had one, should be responsible for catching those things. Right, bad review time. I chose this review because as I was browsing Metacritic, it jumped out at me for how of the time the review slug was. But first, some choice quotes from it. "No, the game won't make you stealthier or improve your aim with a shuriken, but it will make committing seppuku easier because after playing for a couple of hours, you'll actually want to die. Beating these guys the first time is barely more fun than chewing kitty litter thanks to the funky controls." And the pièce de résistance, Fatal Shadows continues on the path of cool ninja stealth action, but is thwarted by a plethora of traps like poor control and retarded AI. I mean, I think we're going to need one of those signs that the studios throw up when talking about all the movies with outdated views and language. I was a kid back then too, and oh boy, did that word get thrown around a lot. Didn't expect to see it in a discussion about Tenchu Fatal Shadows though. But with that, I think we'd better swiftly move on to look at how exactly Fatal Shadows ended up like this. I'm going to make a claim. Tenchu Kurenai was originally meant to be a PSP game. From what little information is available and from what I've researched, there's very little out there documenting the game's development, but through the power of circumstantial evidence, observation, and assumption, I bet I can sway you to my side. Exhibit A. Firstly, we need to rewind the clock to Tenchu Wrath of Heaven and Tenchu Return from Darkness. The former was the original release for the PS2, the latter was a slightly upgraded Xbox exclusive. Wrath of Heaven hit the PS2 in early March 2003. Return from Darkness was released roughly 1 year later in 2004. If we look at the assumption I made in my Wrath of Heaven video, that development for Wrath of Heaven began around the release of Birth of the Stealth Assassins, which was August 2000, and Wrath of Heaven's release date of March 2003, you've got a development timeline of a little over 2 years. Then, just a few months after the release of Return from Darkness, we got the release of Fatal Shadows in July 2004, but that was Japan only. It'd take another 8 or so months to even make it over to the West. So just to recap, number 1, Wrath of Heaven, March 2003, number 2, Return from Darkness, March 2004, and 3, Fatal Shadows, July 2004. In the span of what amounts to a little over a year, that's 3 separate Tenchu releases. Granted, one was a little more than a slight expansion and the other was something else. The development team for all 3 games, both in terms of size and role, remained mostly intact. Mitsuo Kodama served as all 3 games' directors. Masanori Kuwasashi served as the chief planner, though Noriyuki Asakura didn't return for Kurenai outside of the opening song. So what does this all mean? I'm going to assume that, much like what probably happened with the recent Final Fantasy Remake trilogy, you had teams working across multiple entries. As development began to ramp down on one game, members of the team would shift to the next. the ebb and flow of game dev. You've got people familiar with the engine, platform, content pipelines. It's a well-oiled throat-slitting machine. Now, put a pin in that. Just remember, a quick release period made possible by a team familiar with the tech and process. Exhibit B. We now have to leap into the future of December 2004. Along with Shevchenko winning the Ballon d'Or on the 12th of that month, the PlayStation Portable was released in Japan. It arrived with a number of launch titles: Armored Core, Formula Front, Darkstalkers, and Ride Racers, to name a few. Now let's skip ahead to November 2005. Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire was released on November 6th. On the 22nd, the Xbox Turn 360 Degrees and Walk Away came out, and now every child on the planet could soon tell you in great detail how they had violated your mother. If you were alive during that period, you'll recall how Xbox was really trying to make the 360 in Japan happen. They had Sakaguchi's Mistwalker make Lost Odyssey and Blue Dragon. Bandai Namco released Tales of Vesperia, and there were a number of other gaming initiatives to capture Japanese gamers' attention in yen. One of the other games that was released later, a whole 6 months earlier than the West, was Tenchu Z, or Tenchu Z if you're in America. October the 5th, 2006. It'd see a June 2007 release in all other territories. The previous game, Fatal Shadows, released in July 2004, so there was around 2.5 years, factoring in people rolling off during Fatal Shadows testing, blah blah blah. Now put a pin in this too. Just remember, Sony released the PSP in December 2004, Xbox released the 360 in November 2005. They wanted more Japanese exclusives to expand their presence in Japan. Exhibit C is the game itself, so now we can look at the most damning piece of evidence, the game. It's not like Fatal Shadows killed anyone or anything, but it does look like it was developed for a handheld. What does that mean? Let's take a look at one of the most obvious features, character models. A number of character models make a return in some form or another. The monks you'll be familiar with, some of the thugs too. Then there is the reuse in subtler ways, the character rigging for instance. This is basically the joints of the character that dictates its movement animations. I think Shinogi also shares Mr. CEO's grab animation, and Hitoa has a couple of Teshu's moves. Then you have the environments themselves. I'm not combing through my Tenchu 3 footage, but I'm going to say that a number of environmental models and textures have been reused, not to mention the more obvious UI elements. Now, there's absolutely nothing wrong with this. It's smart and allows for a quick turnaround. How do you think we keep getting Yakuza games so frequently? How do you think FromSoft does it? However, there are two more elements that are a lot more obvious that this was a PSP game. Number one is the LOD, or level of detail. You frequently notice pop-in from a distance that the PS2 should have no problem handling. Wrath of Heaven was just fine. Number two, and the most blatant, is the architecting of the levels themselves. Gone are the larger, more expansive zones. You won't find a Punish the Evil Merchant or Assault Tenrise Fortress here. Each mission is a much smaller, intimate affair, and that's for the better and for worse. But you may be thinking to yourself, duh, I knew that. Why do you spend time pointing out something that's so obvious? Then you have to ask yourself, the question is not, why did 2K make a PSP game for the PlayStation 2? It's, why wasn't this released on the PSP? And that is where my wild man guessing comes into play. So, in conclusion, here is what I think happened. Fatal Shadows was originally meant to be a PSP launch title. That's why Rikimaru is purposely not the focus of the game. The timeline in which the game exists is merely a contrivance to make this happen. Fatal Shadows was released in 2004. It was at this time that Activision sold the rights to the series, excluding Tenchu Stealth Assassins and Birth of the Stealth Assassins. In 2005, Tenchu Time of the Assassins was released for the PSP. So you may think, if Time of the Assassins was okay for the PSP, why wasn't Fatal Shadows? My first assumption was that Xbox, who would act as publisher for Tenchu Z, had forbidden any competing platform releases and what could be seen as current-gen platforms, i.e. the PSP. Though it's not explicitly stated anywhere, the fact that Microsoft published the game, they had bankrolled other Japanese studios' games, and it was an exclusive, led me to believe they could have pushed for this. However, it may be that because the rights for Tenchu being signed over from Activision to From Software during this period could have caused some issues. Activision had handled the worldwide publishing rights and release for Wrath of Heaven, don't forget. This is pure speculation, but there could have been platform exclusivity agreements, licensing restrictions, or something else that was specific to Fatal Shadows, stipulations that may have arisen during contract negotiations. As mentioned, Time of the Assassins did release a year later, but that seems more of a rush job and could have been created to make up for the lack of Fatal Shadows coming to the platform. One last little theory is that during all this speculation, someone may have been saying, "What are you on about? Fatal Shadows did come out for the PSP," and you would be correct, but it released in 2010, 6 years after it was technically shippable. Why would it take so long? The Vita would have been coming out the next year. To me, that reeks of an exclusivity or some kind of contract expiring. One of my favourite games is Tales of Vesperia. It was originally released on the Xbox 360 worldwide, but an expanded version was released in Japan sometime after for the PS3. It included Patty and some other stuff. Anyway, it was only after the exclusivity contract expired did we see that version released for the PS4 and other consoles in that generation. Fatal Shadows sets off that same feeling, and 2 years before its release, K2 had been acquired by Capcom as well. The timing's not great, right? At the end of the PSP's life cycle, it was an attempt to get some use out of the game that had been originally designed for the platform. So that's where my rabbit hole led me. K2 had originally wanted to release this as a PSP launch title, couldn't do it because of some contractual issues, so just pushed it out on the PS2. And this was not marketed as an expansion at a cheaper price point either. According to a GameSpot article from October 2004, it was aiming for a February 2005 release at $49.95, which was par for the pricing course at the time. When the exclusivity contract period passed, they finally released it on the PSP, allegedly. If you're coming to Fatal Shadows from Wrath of Heaven or even Return from Darkness, you'll find K2 hasn't messed too much with their previous formula from a moment-to-moment gameplay standpoint. The biggest change is how Fatal Shadows spins its narrative to create a mild butterfly effect in how its story unfolds. Due to Rikimaru not making an appearance in the game, he's still stuck behind a rock in Mael's lair. The game takes place in between the original Stealth Assassins and Wrath of Heaven. Obviously, Ayame wasn't just running around with Kiku to kill time. The funny thing is, as with all these types of games that retroactively take place in the past but are created in the future, is that events of Fatal Shadows are never mentioned in Wrath of Heaven. This time around, you've got a much smaller focused narrative. I'd go so far as to say that Ayame is not the game's protagonist, Rin is. Ayame, unlike Rin, does not go through major change, instead serving as a vehicle which transports us into Rin's conflict. The main narrative thrust is a tried and tested tale of revenge. Rin's village is decimated by unknown assailants, so she sets out on a journey of revenge, becoming an assassin in the process. Throughout Fatal Shadows, we are following both her and Ayame. Rin's main conflict is whether, deep down, she's built for the cutthroat business and if, sometimes, forgiveness or merely acceptance is able to douse the flames of revenge. From an overall aesthetic standpoint, Fatal Shadows absolutely nails something that I brought up way back in my video on Stealth Assassins. Ninjas, samurai, ronin, the Warring States period, they're pop culture ingredients. The series was screaming out for someone to treat them with a pulpy jidaigeki hand. The term jidaigeki simply means period drama. More specifically, Tenchu would fit into the chambara sword fighting genre. Think Lone Wolf and Cub, Zatoichi, and a bunch of Kurosawa films. Kodama Mitsuo and the team finally realised this aesthetic in Fatal Shadows. From the moment the grainy grindhouse filter appears over Adua's opening credits, the tone is set. This flows into how the game no longer treats each mission as a stage, but a chapter of a bloody revenge tale. In the style of those pulpy serialized shows, you're treated to a preview of what's to come. It even bleeds into the poetry-like nature of the narration bookending each chapter. With this, the experience is more akin to playing through a bloody 70s TV show. The biggest flaw with the narrative is that it's just too busy. Fatal Shadows is like someone put a box in front of you and asked you to fit in a bunch of items. You can't leave any of them out. Every single one has to be crammed in there. So what do? Well, you could probably whittle each of the items down, shave off some of the parts. In the end, while you're able to stuff everything in there, they're diminished versions of the originals. It'll become clearer as we go through the game. The best place to start is at the beginning. Gone are the days of CGI intros and cutscenes. The game's got a low budget, so I can't fault them there. Since Stealth Assassins, God has had Ayame wandering about the land, keeping an eye on things. I don't believe that was strictly a ninja's job. Places usually had their own set of law enforcement in some capacity, but we need a reason for the story to happen, so why not? It's in this vagrant lifestyle that Ayame comes across a bunch of dead ninja in a recently raised village, the village of Hagakure. The first bell that may have rung in your head when hearing that name is that it similarly shares with the village in Naruto, Kono Hagakure. If you've watched the anime, then you're probably aware of the translation to hidden leaf. It consists of two kanji, ha for leaf and a noun taken from the intransitive verb kakure, meaning to hide or conceal. But hey, that's kakure and not gakure. Oftentimes in Japanese, when kanji are combined, the sound of the word can change. This is rendaku, and it can be pretty annoying sometimes. You see it in words like yama and kawa becoming yamagawa, hana and hi, hanabi. Hagakure is also the title of a book penned by Yamamoto Tsunetomo, which acts as a practical and spiritual guide for a warrior, written during the time of relative peace in Japan after the Shimbara Rebellion in 1638, which would last for a couple of hundred years. Hagakure's themes still resonate through a lot of Jidaigeki works, namely the death of the samurai class. If you've ever watched Twilight Samurai, Harakiri, and even more recently the Shogun series, they all tackle the metaphorical death of the samurai way of life. Even in Fatal Shadows, we can extrapolate some of the book's themes as both a commentary on both Ayame's role of a ninja in service to Gora and Rin's struggles with the literal act of taking a life. Just don't focus on the narrative dissonance too much. Impromptu film theory and language lessons aside, Fatal Shadows presents its pre-mission spiel backed by ukiyo landscape paintings. Now, I am no art historian, surprise, but I'd say these may be licensed or public domain. However, if the art department created these images, they are awesome. Combined with Gary Martinez's soft, melancholic performance, it really sells each scene. That's not to discredit their writing and localization. They did a bang up job for these parts at least. According to the credits, it's Sega of America. Over recent years, especially with games in the Yakuza series, Sega have proven they arguably had the best localization outfit in the business. Getting into the meat of the game, we start off Fatal Shadows with a familiar face, Ayame. In her tour of the land, she's stumbled upon the raised Hagakure village. The first level sets out to convey a number of things to the player. Firstly, like Punish the Evil Merchant in both Stealth Assassins and Wrath of Heaven, it serves as a training ground, a way to erase the rust from your blades. The tile-based level design of the village feels like a bit of a step backwards, not just from Wrath of Heaven, but general game development at the time. No doubt it was done to make building the levels that much easier, giving the missions a diorama-like feel. Fatal Shadows has a number of new tricks up its sleeve though, particularly the dual stealth kill. Tenchu games have been crying out for a technique like this for ages to spice gameplay up. A shame they never implemented the ledge stealth kills a la Sekiro. And to add some context to the footage, the entire game was played through on the game's hardest difficulty, 3 kunai. I figured I'd been through ninja training school like Naruto via the previous games and wanted to see what Fatal Shadows could throw at me. I'd say if you've played the previous games and want to get the best out of the experience, this is absolutely the difficulty to go for. Most missions are now split up into zones. Think of them as little challenge arenas, often quite compact in their design. You'll often find clusters of enemies dotted around, almost creating a puzzle-like approach to each group and how you plan to either engage or avoid them. It harkens back to the original Stealth Assassins in its ethos around enemy placements and is way at the other end of the spectrum to Birth of the Stealth Assassins. One of my main gripes with that game, and Wrath of Heaven sometimes, was that making large levels, whether by design or technological constraints, you can only populate the space with so many enemies. While the first mission is quite tame, the approach to enemy design and playing on veteran players' expectations only builds from there. To step back from the more mechanical aspects of the first level, if you compare it from a purely aesthetic standpoint, it pales in comparison to Wrath of Heaven. As I'd rattled on about before, it was in response to design constraints. This was going to be a PSP title after all. Whenever I see the blocky design of levels like this, it also reminds me of the Tomb Raider or the first Tenchu game. It's like a giant Lego set. The Hagakure village itself is quite sparse, even compared to the Azuma Ninja village. I mean, I've seen as many chickens bobbing about as I did people strung up and used as pincushions. Ayame's mission in all this is to simply head towards what I assume is the village head's house. As a viewer, we're treated to a little dramatic irony. While we watch the crimson-clad Futaba kill the old man, Ayame is none the wiser. The assassin's quick to masquerade as a corpse while Ayame cradles the old man. With his dying breath, he utters Kuruya before peacing out. Futaba's poised to take a shot at Ayame, but is interrupted by a furious young villager. After a brief exchange of words, both women are ready to throw hands. There's certainly a lot more to say about the battle mechanics, but your first fight with Rin isn't nearly as an infuriating enough stage to do it justice. Instead, you can just hack away at her in a pretty surreal fight because there's just a chicken wandering around, minding its own business. Despite Ayami's seemingly uncharacteristic willingness to kill Rin, she was more interested in disarming the girl. Probing Rin for information on the courier, she does not have a clue. So Ayami's gotten all she can out of the village and has better things to do. Rin, rather than relishing an opportunity to not go the way of her villagers, would rather Ayami kill her than live in dishonor. No such luck though. We even get the classic kid, which I think is mandatory in all forms of media when addressing someone younger and more inexperienced. With the mission over, you'll find the familiar results screen. Not much has changed. You're still ranked on stealth kills, double kills, normal kills provide fewer points, getting spotted does the same, though if you remain unseen throughout the whole level, you get a hefty point boost. Specials, just like it was in Tenchu 2, I think refers to a number of potential modifiers. If you get a perfect execution, if you use items, the type of assassinations, things like that. It's still pretty opaque. What isn't as opaque are your rewards. Unlike Wrath of Heaven, you're provided with a surfeit of items right off the bat, which is a much better idea than trickling a number of them out. Now, along with a stable of common items, you're still rewarded with a unique Grandmaster item after the end of each stage. A new addition, which I'll just mention briefly here, is that collecting scrolls and turning them in at the end of a mission is how you earn new skills. Techniques include a number of new skills and some returning favourites. With all that wrapped up, you're treated to a preview of the next mission before you jump right into it. Cool concept, but there's around 1 minute before you're literally watching what was just previewed, but anyway.
Defeat, farewells. Gone are the days of laughter. There was no doubt in Rin's heart. Next on Tenchu Fatal Shadows, determination. Evil will perish in a flash of crimson.
We next switch it up to Rin's perspective. She's obviously been off somewhere only to have returned to the village and find it in ruins. We meet her where Ayami did, having arrived just too late. Rin's comforting Futaba, who, with her dying, big air quotes there, breath, instructs the girl to escape the village. After Futaba's hammed it up enough for Rin to buy her words and leave, she's all ready to snipe her in the back. A mysterious man with a parasol, or bangasa, as I believe it's called, stays Futaba's arm. He's rocking a chonmage, once more associated with samurai, but more recently with sumo wrestlers, as well as a sick eye patch. Obviously the leader of the bunch, he's the one who wishes Rin to live. We're also introduced to Ranzo, another ninja, who's been tasked with luring Ayame to Hagogake. Finally, there's Shinogi. In such a short span of time, Fatal Shadows does put a strong foot forward with its characterization. Futaba's painted as petulant, two-faced and impatient, as passionate and fiery as the clothes she wears. Then we have their leader, equally as red, however much cooler and calculating. You'd think someone with impaired vision may characteristically lean towards being short-sighted, and his haircut is actually thematically important, but we'll get to that later. As for Ranzo, he definitely looks cool. Outfit aside, that hunched lackadaisical feel pairs well with the sadistic twinge in his voice. On the other side of the coin is Shinogi, whose VO brings more of an indifferent air. After the cutscene, we're finally in control of Rin. However, while you, the player, may not be aware, you've already slightly altered the timeline with your actions. Depending on certain factors within specific missions, the path will diverge to an A or a B route. While much cooler in theory than it is in practice, it's no more than a glorified enemy layout change. However, in some instances, such as with this specific mission, 2.2, you're tasked with eliminating all of the enemies present. You only get this mission if you eliminated all the enemies in the previous level with Ayame. If you didn't, then you're on 2.1, Departures. In that mission, you're free to just make it to the end of the level, so a pretty light touch. However, it did pick on something I mentioned regarding previous games, replayability and mission diversity. Aside from the odd don't get spotted mission, the previous games never made a particular effort to implement some simple methods to add another dimension to the games. Funnily enough, it arrived with K2's Tenchu Z or Zan, as well as with Acquire's Shinobido games. As for its implementation in this mission, it's fine. I usually go around slaughtering anything with a pulse in these games by default, whether they be man, beast or chicken. Rin functionally plays similar to all the other playable characters in this engine. Like Tenchu, she utilizes her fists in combat, which, given the game's issues with combat, only becomes more of an issue as you progress. But during that progression, you will have access to not only unique items, but skills. Again, this was another issue I brought up in Wrath of Heaven. What really differentiated Rikimaru and Ayame? With Fatal Shadows, K2 made a good, if not great, effort to distinguish both protagonists. The only way you'll be able to see those differences is if you're diligently collecting scrolls. You have no doubt noticed that once stealth killed, every enemy acts like a meat pinata, fountaining out a scroll or 5. Then, in an insane decision that I still do not understand, you have to then pick up the scrolls. If they don't, they soon disappear. Now, why aren't scrolls automatically added to your inventory? The only logical reason I could think of is that it's K2's attempt at implementing poorly some kind of risk and reward. You just assassinate a target in a pretty precarious spot, other enemies may see you any second. Do you chance picking up the scroll? Honestly, if that was the intention, it does not work. Picking up scrolls is just annoying busy work. What scroll-based skill unlock system also does, for better or worse, is penalize a player who chooses a more pacifist approach. You're punished for not slaughtering everyone. I've mentioned Aragami before, and yes, that game was released much later than Fatal Shadows, but one of the mechanics it implemented is that by not being seen playing as a pacifist, you are equally rewarded. If you had a system in that vein, then you're providing the player with much more rope to play with. To remedy this, you could have simply tied skill unlocks to level score. Within this specific mission, it's not too egregious because you're tasked with executing all of the hostile ninja. The level does introduce some nice environmental factors that it will later build on, such as your character's presence in water and neat patrol paths along the banks of the stream. Similar to Ayami's first outing, Rin's escape from a village is your initiation to the character. Chapter 2's end sees Rin departing on a small boat, bidding a farewell to a village before donning the Kitsune mask and swearing vengeance.
Ayame follows Juzo to the village of Hakogake, but there she faces an unexpected opponent. Next on Tenchu Fatal Shadows, the geisha and the hired blade, evil will perish in a flash of crimson.
In Chapter 3, we are back with Ayame. Here again, the story paths bifurcate, impacting some of the nuances with this mission. First time through, it was a pretty simple affair of making it from one side of the map to the other. The first area is a built-up, and I use that term lightly, town area. You've got verticality with the houses, but also need to be wary of the raised section to your left. One element that's more heavily introduced here, and the backbone of a decent stealth game, is the line of sight, or domino effect. In the context of a stealth game, it's being aware of what risks you're taking when choosing your target, with the heavier emphasis on intersecting patrol paths and more natural routes guard take. No longer can you blindly run up to an enemy when their back is turned. Now more than any other game, there's a large emphasis on patience and observing your surroundings. The double-edged tanto with this is that it's not a style for everybody. Obviously, I love it because on the one hand, you're actively solving a puzzle and determining which kills are safe and when, and on the other, assassinations are much more earned this time around. Wrath of Heaven felt much more geared towards an unobstructed approach to dealing with enemies. See your enemy, wait until their back is turned, strike. No such luck in Fatal Shadows because each guard is now much more intertwined with the others in the area. Following this, you then proceed to the next area. You have paths either side of you and a woman walking back and forth in the center. Obviously, you just take one of the side routes. However, a cute thing the game does is that regardless of which side you take, at a certain point around halfway, she'll always look in your direction, potentially catching you. It's just a little thing I noticed on multiple run-throughs. Beyond this section, you're again in an area with a bunch of housing on the way to a shrine. You'll see the shamisen-wielding geishas as you're going about, which I believe use some of the same rigging as the kunoichi. One more frustrating aspect of the levels is that with their visual blandness, there's very little to actually talk about. I mean, the previous games had more diverse locations, interesting historical facts, or evoked something unique to that time period. Because all of Fatal Shadows levels are built with a kit, there is little beyond them from a purely mechanical standpoint. You could replace the whole game with grey boxes like you do in the alpha, and honestly wouldn't lose anything. Alternatively, if you were playing the other version of this mission, you'd be more focused on being frustrated than the game's bland scenery. You end up following Juzo, the guy with the eye patch, as he goes on a midnight jaunt through the town. Of course, you can't be seen by him, nor can you let him out of your sight, lest you fail the mission. Now, I know following someone unseen is kind of part of a ninja's duties, but it feels like the equivalent of them filing paperwork at the office. They'd rather be out there throwing poison rice at people. I honestly can't think of any game that has managed to implement a follow this person mission that hasn't been boring. By design, you are the passive agent in the scenario. Maybe one of the earlier Assassin's Creed games managed to pull it off by virtue of a much more in-depth traversal system. I appreciate the switch up in style, but it's just a time sink. Obviously, Juzo has his little "oh, nearly got you there" moments where he'll gank a look back, but because you have the safety of the rooftops, Ayami's just squatting there like a gargoyle watching Juzo stroll around town. Regardless of whether you've been tailing Juzo or made your way to the shrine under your own steam, we discover that our old man is meeting up with his bit on the side. Ayami wastes no time in announcing herself, ready to make an attempt on Juzo's life, but his lady friend steps up instead. She has no health, terrible attacks, and can be easily curb-stomped by Ayame. If you do let her attack, she'll actually poison Ayame, and if you're not careful, then the lady can do a number on you. Not that it ever happened to me, of course. Though Ayami didn't quite finish her off, the geisha would prefer Juzo have that honor. He doesn't play with needy women. Both Ayame and Juzo tussle a little, with the man getting the upper hand, both figuratively and literally when the dying geisha clings onto Ayami's ankle. Despite having a decent chance to finish off Ayame, Juzo chooses not to take it and instead flees. The ninja is now, as she puts it, back to square one.
6 months have passed since Rin left the village. She finds herself in Iwatsu, working as a hired assassin. Next on Tenchu Fatal Shadows, I am Rin of the Benya. Evil will perish in a flash of crimson.
In Chapter 4, we are catching up with Rin 6 months after the attack on the Hagakure village. Her meanderings have led her to the land of Iwatsu, where she joins a group of assassins, the Benya. We join Rin along with fellow Benya member Kichigoro as she navigates Bugetsu Cave in order to assassinate the bandit leader, Katsuragi. This is our first taste of the tried and tested cave level. It's like an old school JRPG where you'll traverse a desert, a forest, a snow environment, acting as a facsimile of places around the world. In Tenchu, we often sneak through caves, castle towns, and forests. The change in scenery also offers an opportunity for the level design to throw up some unique challenges. Cave levels in Tenchu were always my most disliked, not for any particular rational reason. I didn't like the lack of verticality and general flatness of navigating winding tunnels. We've come a long way from Rescue the Captive Ninja in Tenchu 1 and Bugetsu Cave, while still literally using the same assets from the Limestone Cavern from Wrath of Heaven, rearranges the pieces in a much more engaging fashion. The funny thing is, Bugetsu Cave is actually a spiritual remake of Rescue the Captive Ninja. Other people may have noticed it, but there are some clear homages to the level. Having played all the games to death, it couldn't help catching my eye. The clearest indicator is the section where there is a stone bridge along which a guard patrols. Off to the side, there's also a platform that you can chance to jump to, much safer in this version than Stealth Assassins. In addition to that is our good friend Kuma. Ayami's level is reversal of this one, so there's not much to spoil, but she kicks it off with fighting a bear, and where have we seen that before? Remaking or FF7 rebirthing the levels is actually a cool idea and acts like a glow up to these once super blocky Lego-like levels. There may have been a nod to the waterfall section from another level in Stealth Assassins, but that's me reaching a bit there. Again, it's the enemy placement that elevates Bugetsu Cave. Pair that with the variety of pathways winding through the mission and you've given more freedom to approach problems than you may initially believe. As a further homage to Stealth Assassins, the first area features a dog and a guard. The former was an enemy type that was sorely underused in Wrath of Heaven, but its inclusion in Fatal Shadows is nothing short of sadistic. Rin can literally not hit this thing. Barely any strike connects with the Demon Woofer, and now, unlike previous installments, shurikens don't one-shot these guys. You have to use a blow dart or a ninja tool with equal killing power. The wider path in the caves also work against you because cover is sparse and enemy patrols deliberately obfuscate their comrades. Oftentimes, you'll think you're safe, only to get you baited and caught when going for the kill. This is a reason why the Poison Rice Ball skyrockets to GOAT status, because disrupting patrol paths once again turns into a vital weapon in your arsenal. Another little detail I both loved and which frustrated me in a good way is the use of environmental hazards. After progressing to the waterfall area, like in Stealth Assassins, if you're sprinting through the water, the guards will hear your splashes. It seems obvious in hindsight, but because you've not encountered it up until now, and it was used extremely sparingly in previous games, I couldn't help smiling when it caught me out the first time. It's something so simple, but being forced to crawl totally changes how you approach that enemy encounter. When all's said and done, Rin dons her Kitsune mask and confronts the bandit leader. Rin's a little inexperienced with the whole assassin spiel, and her target appears somewhat indifferent about his impending death. Now, I thought there'd be a boss fight here, and maybe at some point it was planned, but it's handled in cutscene. A brief exchange of blades, and Rin finishes him off. Though not explicitly stated, we can gather from Rin's exchange with Kichigoro that this was the girl's first contract. I don't think that Kichigoro was breaking out the ninja fireworks for the occasion, but it's probably for the best because Rin isn't sure what kind of mood she's in.
As Rin completes her assignment, there is another figure in the shadows. Ayame watches silently. Next on Tenchu Fatal Shadows, fated reunions. Evil will perish in a flash of crimson.
Rin's not the only one who had an appointment with the bandit leader. Ayame, believing the man had ties to Juzo, had pursued him to Bagetsu Cave as well. Unbeknowingly, Rin went ahead and sniped Ayame's prey, leaving her with nothing except a giant grizzly problem. The bear literally seems to spawn out of thin air with a salmon in its jaws. Maybe it was the bandit leader's pet. Are these the same bandits from Stealth Assassins? Probably not. For one, there was a giant Onikage spawning hole in the roof. Two, if Ayame went back, she'd probably reminisce about the time she bailed Rikimaru out of jail. Either way, you pretty much have to defeat the bear. You can run away, but it'll make a commotion and you'll be fighting both the bear and a bunch of guards, which isn't a recipe for a good time. Defeating the bear is surprisingly easy. Despite it having some gnarly attacks, its laborious movements provide plenty of time for Ayame to zip around to its blind side. With the bear defeated, your troubles are only beginning. Your route out of the cave is the reverse of the route Rin originally took. The first guard encounter, featuring 3 of them, is genuinely challenging because their movement patterns don't give you an inch. You're very much relying on having looked out by bringing the appropriate items or have replayed the level enough times to be familiar with their movements. Even if you assassinate the first guard, chances are the guy on the left will see you, and if he doesn't, the one on the right will. Scenarios like this are frustrating and can feel a little unfair, but in a good way. It's making you cognizant of the various enemy patterns you'll encounter and get the cogs turning about which items will help surmount obstacles. One such item is the blow dart, second only to the rice in utility. I bring it up, 1, because since its introduction in Birth of the Stealth Assassins, it's a go-to ninja tool, but also because it frustrates me to no end. Its distance was either nerfed or there was a draw distance limitation in place for how far the game lets you fire this thing. Unless you're several paces away, it just vanishes into the ether. While you should be quite familiar with the enemy patrols because they haven't changed a great deal, a shout out is needed for the final grove-like area. You have these 3 patrolling guards basically hovering around the exit. It's not just one element but a mixture of them that coalesce. It's the thick trees offering you cover but obscuring enemies. It's the waist-high grass that does the same. If you do assassinate a guard, you'd better drag their body away quick before someone notices. Fatal Shadow's focus on the little things is what makes the larger experience engaging. If and when you finally make it to the other side, the encounter with Rin only proves to be a prelude. The 2 will be running into each other again very soon.
Rin and Ayame face off once more. The return of Futaba has Rin overjoyed, but Futaba soon shows her true intent. Next on Tenchu Fatal Shadows, the blind masseuse. Evil will perish in a flash of crimson.
Depending on if you were spotted during the previous mission with Ayame, there are 2 ways this mission can shake down. If you manage to maintain stealth throughout the entirety of the caves, then Fatal Shadows bumps up the difficulty. What lurks in the shadows, the 6.2 variant, is a pure stealth mission. If you're spotted, it's game over, no checkpoints, no nothing. And this mission is no pushover. You've been dispatched by the leader of the Benia, Lady Razor Ogin, to Yakushimachi. Here, a blind masseuse has been paralyzing his customers, and then having his way with them is probably the most sanitized way of describing it. Your task is to dispense some justice by infiltrating his manor. It's like a much more dumbed down version of Punish the Evil Merchant from Wrath of Heaven. However, even by using simple claustrophobic geometry, it's a mission that's engaging because of its swiftly changing scenery. The first area does a couple of cute things, like the small fence you can use to circle around this oddly raised area. I mean, it has no reason to exist as it does in the world, but it does fashion a small area inhabited by an NPC. You've got to manage him while trying to take out the guards. One element I mentioned before is that Fatal Shadows embraces the use of natural obstacles a lot more. This brings more attention back to your key meter. It's more of an indication than ever of when the right time to strike will be. I also appreciate how the trees obscure your view of the area below. I often found myself squinting at the screen, trying to pick out a moving body between pixelated foliage. The next area isn't particularly significant, aside from the fact that you run into Ayame once again. You can use the little lanes provided by the fences to roll yourself all the way along the perimeter for some takedowns though. We are thrust into another battle with the ninja, but from Rin's perspective this time. The age-old Wrath of Heaven hitbox frustration is back in full force with this fight. I hope you brought a bunch of health potions and are willing to run away like a coward to chug them, either that or the gun or bazooka weapons Rin has access to. Ayame, like most of the bosses, does love to grab you the second you stop attacking, or she'll launch a kunai your way. The only saving grace is that you don't have to reduce her health all the way. With the battle done, it's time for a second reunion. Futaba. She was spying on Ayame, who was spying on Rin, it'd seem. At first elated by her friend's return, Futaba's true motivations are revealed as she takes a shot at Rin. The ninja tells Rin that Futaba was responsible for burning down the Hagakure village. Rin questions her supposed old friend for confirmation, and she gets it when Futaba shoots her. Luckily, it's just a graze. Enraged, Rin rushes down Futaba, disarms her, but starts feeling a little woozy. That would be the poison arrow. But before Futaba finishes her off, Ayame steps up once again. After she's managed to shove Rin over what I assume is a pretty shallow stream, she breaks out the old signature Street Fighter throw before making her escape, only for her to drop one of the sister bells. A gift entrusted to her by Princess Kiku, she's not about to leave that behind. Crawling on her hands and knees, Ayame blacks out mere inches away from the sister bells. Incidentally, there's the sound of the arrow being pulled out of Ayame's shoulder. That is K2's go-to sound effect for anything flesh-related in the game. Let me just do a supercut.
Will follow shortly.
Anyway, we're back with Rin, who somehow didn't drown and managed to haul herself onto a path just as she hears the signal from one of her contacts. This area is what you make of it. Like Punish the Evil Merchant, both versions, you're to infiltrate the mansion from an opening in an attic. If you're playing the version of this level where being seen is an insta-fail, then you'd best believe you want the path of least resistance whenever you get the opportunity. I'm glad this was during my second run through the game, because unless you're stuffing your pants with invisibility scrolls or enemy disguises, it's a decent challenge on the game's hardest difficulty. When you've entered the house, it's not quite on the level of Wrath of Heaven, but there are some nice touches like the ability to crawl under what I assume are sake barrels. One area I think K2 missed a trick in Fatal Shadows, well, two areas. One, when you're crawling through these little gaps, you can't utilize any items. It would have been cool to use the blowgun or rice, for instance. The other is that when you're crouched and use an item, your character stands up. Kind of not great when you're explicitly using it for a distraction. Another cool little detail in the level that just fulfills the ninja fantasy is being able to grapple up to the chandelier. It's a cool little detail. Now, for the actual mission, there are two ways you can handle it. One is confronting the masseuse outright and getting yourself into quite a tough boss battle. The other is utilizing a secret entrance which affords you the more appropriate stealth kill scenario. Rin silently eavesdrops on Nasu, who is busy with a patient. He readjusts her spine like one of those chiropractor ASMR videos. I can't get over the woman's eyes, they remind me of a snowman. Nasu paralyzes the woman and starts feeling her up. Luckily, Rin's been party to all of this. Her blade pierces the tatami and plunges into Nasu's gut. Then, what I'm assuming is sleeping gas, knocks the woman out before Rin creeps into the room. It seems Kichigoro, the one making the bird sounds, has been watching our back, but instead of heading back home, Rin's got some unfinished business to attend to. Typically, after the final cutscene and target assassination, the mission's over. Not this time. You head through a secret door with a lone guard patrolling. It is extremely easy to get caught by the guard because what Fatal Shadows loves doing, which I applaud it for, is no longer having guards stop at corners. They'll just keep going, and then, more often than not, they'll spot you. It's such a small thing, but alters the way you approach every guard at a corner because you no longer have that safety net. It finally makes the cling to ceiling ability, as well as the use of distraction items, much more viable. It's proof that just a tiny change can have a rippling effect. As much as I'll praise it, if I was doing the stealth run of this level and that woman caught me out, I would have lost my shit. Game design be damned. It's a strange addendum to the level. You literally assassinate or avoid the guard, head down the stairs, and then the mission's over. I honestly don't understand its inclusion. It does connect to the next mission with Ayame, it just has an extremely strange sense of flow, like if I... As we've already established, Fatal Shadows was created on a tighter budget. A lot of assets were reused. That goes for the enemies too. While models may be different, their movesets and rigging are relatively unchanged. The geishas are reused kunoichi, who make an appearance too. The guards with the masks are Red Oni from Wrath of Heaven, that kind of thing. Not to mention our pals the monks make a comeback. With how things stand, there's not much to say about them aside from the enhancements to the AI. Reviewers were critical of the enemy, I agree. They give up quickly. I doubt it's an oversight. It's intentional. It's a result of emphasizing a faster-paced flow to the gameplay. If you've been spotted and run away, you want another bite of the cherry as soon as possible, creating a more arcadey feel to the gameplay. At one end of the stealth spectrum, you have games like Aragami and Shadow Tactics Blades of the Shogun, which I've talked about before. In these games, there are accommodations for more punishing stealth systems. You've got checkpoints or the ability to save scum. That's fine. At their core, those stealth games emphasize the notion of trying and trying and trying again until you perfect your path forward. In the center, you've got NGS. Stealth's a large part of the game, but it's not the be-all and end-all. You can afford to get spotted and it not affect too much beyond your ranking come the end of the game. For Tenchu, due to the smaller scope of the levels and the fact they're less of a time investment for a run, they can afford to be much more lenient. Would a checkpoint system of some sort have been a welcome addition to Fatal Shadows? Absolutely, especially with how the bosses can be. As it stands, I don't mind the forgiving AI when it comes to cooldowns. For other aspects of the enemy AI, such as patrol paths, I've already said they're much improved and provide and succeed in asking the player difficult questions. Stealth games, in a sense, are puzzle games. Throwing in immersive sim elements like items or various pathways to your target a la Hitman are great ways to reward players for their imagination. Guards in Fatal Shadows on harder difficulties will spot you fairly easily and make you pay for your mistakes, much more than they ever did in the previous entries. My issues with enemies don't so much come down to reusing models or goldfish-like memories, it's the fact that the enemies themselves don't build on improvements to patrols and sightlines. Yeah, budget was probably an issue, and yeah, archers have historically greater sightlines, but there's still room to dust off some assets from the previous game. Animals are severely underutilized. They're a pain in the ass to kill, which feels like a hitbox issue, but they force you to approach a situation differently. We can see this in the cross the checkpoint mission and in the cave level. Even as much as I hated the creatures from Amagai Castle, at least they propagated an interesting encounter. Ultimately, it's a strong C+.
Man, I gotta go pee.
Because we encountered Ayame while playing through Rin's version of events, it's pretty obvious we'll be picking up with the Kunoichi in this level. If, during the 6.2 version of the previous mission, where you were forced to maintain stealth, you picked up a map, then you'll be playing a slightly different version of Chapter 7. Ayame finds herself in a similar position to the events in Wrath of Heaven. She's been knocked out and imprisoned in a dungeon of sorts. Instead of Tenchu saving her bacon, it's Rin. The previous dip in the river seems to have doused the flames of animosity Rin held towards Ayame. It's clear now that she wasn't responsible for what happened to the Hagakure. Rin tosses Ayame antivenom to cure the last of the poison in her system. However, instead of making her escape, there's still some unfinished business, retrieving the stolen sister bell. Before leaving, Ayame asks Rin a favor, deliver a letter to Mimizuku, an associate. As the caves were previously, you're doing a reverse run of this mission with Ayame. A new pathway has opened up, and there are a few alternate routes through the level. Overall, it's quite enjoyable because it mixes in elements like the secret doors, waterways, and blind corners. One frustrating design element that came so close to being remedied in Fatal Shadows is stealth in front of doors. Back in Wrath of Heaven, there was no way to peek through a door. While you can do it in Fatal Shadows, its utility is severely hamstrung. Oftentimes, it gives you no advantage because you can't even see the enemy. Little changes, but 7.2 does give us access to the Dokuto blades for Ayame. You'll remember these from Wrath of Heaven. During the escape from Amagai Castle, you could collect these poison blades. When you draw the Dokuto blades, you'll temporarily poison yourself. If you have an antidote on hand, you can cure this affliction instantly. If not, you'll simply have to endure it. While not that effective on the common scrubs, the blades do come into their own in boss battles. Poison is a frustrating status ailment because it'll cause you to spasm, stopping you mid-attack, and you'll find yourself convulsing when trying to chug a potion. Once you've made it close to where Rin had previously entered the mansion, you'll find one of the courier, Shinogi, waiting for you. Against expectations, Shinogi happily returns the sister bell to Ayame, only asking why Ayame is bothering with the courier in the first place. A similar rationale pops up again from previous titles. Killing for money is somehow immoral, whereas killing for your lord is morally justifiable. An interesting philosophical point for sure, but not the one that Fatal Shadows is focused on. Despite Shinogi's calm demeanor, he's someone that kills for pleasure. When he draws a small tanto and stuffs it in his mouth like Zoro, we obviously got a fight on our hands. Not a particularly difficult fight, he lacks range and doesn't have too much health. If you're using the Dokuto blades, it's even easier, and as I said before, his throw is the same as Mr. CEO from Wrath of Heaven. With Shinogi's defeat, there's no cutscene, no nothing. It's just straight on to Rin's mission. However, by now, chances are we've gathered the majority of ninja tools that both Rin and Ayame will have at their disposal, so let's see if they've improved from Wrath of Heaven. It wouldn't be Tenchu without some ninja tools to poison, explode, heal yourself, or just generally cause some chaos. Items remain largely unchanged from Wrath of Heaven, but there are some new additions and character-specific items for you to play with. Items are largely divided by their utility. You've got support items like armor, health potions and power scrolls, stealth-specific tools like the blow dart, poison rice and enemy disguise, and attack items like guns, the bazooka, and the fire scroll. The staples are of course the blow dart and poison rice ball. As said, the blow dart feels a little nerfed because the range has been decreased, but it's still an extremely useful item for thinning numbers or taking out guards in an awkward position. The rice ball is a mainstay in my arsenal for its ability to pull guards out of their patrols, even more important given the more complicated pathways enemies travel. So let's throw up a tier list. With limited numbers of items and the knowledge of what you may encounter in a mission, there is a sense of handicapping yourself by experimenting, when it's a toss-up between your rice and darts, potions, and maybe a powerful weapon to dispose of a boss. You've got an extra slot or two for anything additional. For support items, armor can be helpful if you're worried about taking hits from a difficult boss, though bringing a gun to a sword fight is a decent remedy for this. It's the same with the Ninja Rebirth. If you're not planning on getting hit, then who needs defense? The invisibility spell is still goated and often superior to the enemy disguise because you can just slice through multiple enemies in seconds. Other items like the Beehive, while interesting in its premise, it can take out a guard if they cross its path. The blow dart is often superior. I was most excited for the wind-up rat because it sounds awesome on the surface, a little Nezumi that can explode an enemy. However, I've driven shopping carts with busted wheels that handle better than that rat, not to mention its range is appalling. If you had designs of using the item to sweep around a corner and ignite some fool, there's more chance the rodent will explode you in some mental rat-human suicide pact. The caltrops actually have some utility this time around, especially when combined with the weapons in order to melt bosses. So too are the shurikens, when you unlock the skill that allows you to one-shot an enemy with a headshot. Distraction items like the fireworks and the wind chimes are very situational, so they're better for pacifist runs. So Fatal Shadows finds itself in the same position as Wrath of Heaven. Too many items with overlapping uses, or not enough thought put into the situations where they're best utilized. Honestly, I'm still better that Exploding Rat didn't live up to my lofty hopes.
Rin contacts Mimizuko, a Goda operative. Is Rin not fit to be an assassin? Next on Tenchu Fatal Shadows, a task without reward. Evil will perish in a flash of crimson.
On her way to the border, Rin is grappling with the revelation that Juzo was the true culprit behind the attack on the Hagakure village. Able to suppress her need for vengeance to fulfill her promise, we join Rin for another blast from the past. One of Stealth Assassin's most challenging levels, one that wasn't even included in the original Japanese release, was Cross the Checkpoint. The level, created later in development, served as a crystallization of lessons learned around enemy placement and level design. And the moment you grapple up to the large wooden gate, memories of that level may well come flooding back. Guard patrols and the level layout are nearly identical. Even with all the new tricks up your sleeve and ninja tools at your disposal, the mission is no pushover. There are a ton of crisscrossing routes, and due to the claustrophobic level, chances are, when you're sneaking up on a guard, you'll enter another's line of sight. Even the first area is a great encapsulation of following that thread, through trial and error, to determine which tools you should use and in what order you're best taking out your targets. The level itself is a testament to the work on the original game. Very little has changed, and yet it's still a compelling mission because it's putting everything you've learned up to this point to the test. Essentially, Rin is playing the first half of the level, which culminates after you cross the bridge. Here, Rin will meet up with Mimizuku. Turns out a familiar face is waiting for us, Kichigoro, part-time Benia assassin, full-time Goda spy, it'd seem. Rin has trouble understanding why, despite seemingly having no quarrel with the courier, people like Kichigoro and Ayame insist on hunting them down. Kichigoro plays it off as loyalty to their lord. He also drops an observation: Rin's too caring for this line of work, so she should get out while she still can. I touched on that being Rin's main journey close to the beginning of this thing, but as for Kichigoro's reading, shouldn't you be concerned that a group of powerful ninja who clearly have access to hundreds of soldiers and raise their own village? I mean, it doesn't take a genius to figure out they've probably got bigger designs, and again, Goda's like, yeah, just one ninja should be sufficient in dealing with this problem. I'll assume the land of Goda is going through some extreme budgeting in the wake of the end of Stealth Assassins, but now we can catch up with the Azuma's hardest working ninja once again.
Ayame follows Rin through the border gate at Shishiyano. Many enemies lie ahead in waiting. Next on Tenchu Fatal Shadows, Foreign Lands. Evil will perish in a flash of crimson.
The choice that affects the way the next mission plays out is the very first thing we'll determine in Chapter 9. Without introduction, Ayame's thrust into a battle against 3 enemies, a Kunoichi, a Thug, and a Ronin. Make no mistake, getting ganged up on in Fatal Shadows is not the pathway to a long life. You may well want to stock up on items or have the ninja armor for this one. Alternately, you can cheese the battle by hopping up onto those lookout posts and crouch attacking anyone who dares come close like a irate cat on a shelf. Technically, the Kunoichi and the Thug are the weakest. If you defeat both of them before the Ronin, an alternate cutscene will play where he escapes. However, if you defeat him first or second, the scene plays out differently. Being spotted in this battle doesn't affect anything, but it's a little harsh if you're trying to achieve a decent score and want to restart. Though less of a direct homage to the second half of Cross the Checkpoint from Stealth Assassins, the DNA is certainly there. The bamboo, the winding path through the centre. The bridge is a new addition though. It's a relatively short affair, but you still have to pick your battles and routes carefully. Skirting around either side isn't as viable as you think because of the lines of sight from opposite sides of the gully. Not to mention, going through the centre doesn't do you any favours either. What is definitely effective is the invisibility scroll because you can whip this thing out and then go and clean house. Ayame does eventually meet up with Rin, who's just finished up with Kichigoro. The two exchange a few brief words, marking Fatal Shadow's move towards the final levels of the game. Banshu Road is the first pure forest level in Fatal Shadows, and our old friends the monks are back. Depending on how you handled the attack squad in Ayame's previous mission, you have to deal with extra frustration. It's like when a child makes a parent's breakfast, but they've burnt the toast and spilled the orange juice everywhere. You appreciate the intent, the execution was just lacking. That's how Chapter 10.1 is of Banshu Road. You're tasked with finding these small Jizo statues and turning them in an alternate direction in order to confuse and deter returning members of the Kuroya from finding their secret base. We'll get to the issues with that in a moment, but despite its inclusion, this is still one of Fatal Shadow's best levels. It's one of the first times in the series that actually being in a forested area is used for full, frustrating effect. Due to the alternating elevations of the mountain, paired with the thick overgrowth, it's extremely difficult to determine enemy locations. The key meter and taking your time are rarely placed front and center. When you've grappled up to an area, crouch in the shrub, you may think you're unseen, but you might as well have a little balloon attached to you. It would have been cool if the brush actually concealed you, but it's possible that would have detracted from the overall challenge of the level. Some classic frustrations return. Jumping across gaps can be janky at times, and the pitiful range of the blow dart is just a pain in the arse. Not to mention if you forget to move one of the little statues and you have to backtrack. If you do make it past the first zone, there's a scene similar to the large bridge from Metal Gear Solid 3 in the next area. The tight patrol here is genuinely a challenge to try and circumvent because you need to reach the next statue. Then you've got to shimmy across the rope bridge to the other side. If you're out of blow darts, then getting the timing wrong just sees Rin hanging there in shame like Raiden from MGS2. When you have finally turned all the statues the wrong way, Rin can move on to meet a familiar face to anyone who's played Wrath of Heaven. Our contact is actually Zenosuke. The letter Rin hands off to the old man makes it clear that Ogin, the boss of the Bennies, life is in danger. Just as Rin is about to rush off and report back, a couple of uninvited guests appear. It's Futaba, and though we've yet to even see him before, Hitoa, Futaba's brother. You'll be facing off with both of them, and each has their part to play. Futaba stands back and fires off arrows while her brother gets up close and personal. The easier way to approach the fight is basically to have Futaba use her arrows as friendly fire, as they'll damage her brother just as well as Rin. The issue with range thankfully doesn't crop up too much in this fight because both are essentially utilising their fists. However, if you're not careful, Hitoa can get you in a full Nelson while his sister turns you into a pincushion. The easiest method is of course bringing a big ass weapon. to a fistfight. The gun or the bazooka can make short work of Hitowa, and while you may be tempted to focus on Futaba because she's technically weaker, if you defeat her first, Hitowa goes Super Saiyan, becoming a tougher opponent. All in all, compared to some of the other boss battles, it does feel a little more balanced in that you have to find a way to inflict damage by making good use of your dodging abilities. But because battles are by no means easy and there's no retry, you're often forced to prioritize your item selection based on how much faith you're willing to put in the game's combat mechanics, and I am a man of little faith. The skirmish ends with Futaba still refusing to take the L, remaining petulant until the end. Though it won't become clear just yet, there is a reason why, throughout the entire game, Futaba's being possessed of a particular animosity towards Rin. Not content with just Zenosuke, we're treated to the bald head and toned thighs of everyone's favourite masseuse, Teshu Fujioka. Going off Zenosuke's appearance, it's obvious that the events of Wrath of Heaven are yet to come since the old man's still kicking. Despite his handiwork, it seems that Hitowa strangely has life left in him before his flames finally extinguished. With the Kuroya's elite dwindling, next up on the list is Ranzo. But first, I reckon we've seen all the permutations of Fatal Shadow's approach to level design, so let's examine it a little deeper. When you break down Fatal Shadows into pure geometry, enemy placements and patrols, then examine it from that perspective, it's one of the best constructed Tenchu games. Technically, you could greybox the whole game, by which I mean simply have the untextured geometry, and you'd lose very little. It's both the strength and a weakness. Due to the low budget, there's a greater focus on using rudimentary assets you've created in the most compelling ways possible. That's great, but the consequence is that all levels kind of blend together in a melange. The previous entries had a great sense of bringing historically inspired locations to life, whether it was an estate, temple, checkpoint, forest, fortress. Missions from the other entries possessed a unique, engaging quality. They wove the architecture and culture of the period into a stealth experience. In Fatal Shadows, locations simply aren't aesthetically memorable. I'd hesitate to call it a failure because it was obviously a deliberate choice. There's only so much you can do with the same houses, sewers and caves, as opposed to creating unique assets for each stage. Aside from the way the constituent pieces, guards and geometry are utilised, another mechanic Fatal Shadows flirts with to little success is the branching mission pathways. Without a guide, I'm not sure how you're supposed to figure out some of them, especially when it's a caveat like being seen or unseen during a mission. While there are some minor changes, enemy placements, the grander mechanics like being spotted or meeting a contact or eliminating every enemy are surface level challenges. There's also no material change to the grander narrative. You may get the odd extra scene here and there, but this feels like one of those decisions you make during pre-production and get too far along in development before realizing it doesn't quite work. It's too late to yank it out because you've already put in a ton of work, so what do? You just soldier on. It's a mechanic that was briefly visited in Shinobi Hyakusen. It works in that instance because the mission types vary greatly, and it was also kind of expanded on in Time of the Assassins because each protagonist had a branching storyline. In Fatal Shadows, it's all a little undercooked. Having choices in the game affect something like Rin's path in the end would have been an interesting outcome of your actions. Instead, it comes across as a method of artificially inflating the length of the game, but it's not all bad. If the intention was to make the purest test of stealth for the player, then it was a success. I'll just always wonder what this game would have been like if it had the same amount of resources that Wrath of Heaven enjoyed.
Ranzo's blade clashes with Ayami's double swords at the playhouse at Hitu Beach. Next on Tenchu Fatal Shadows, a dance of swords. Evil will perish in a flash of crimson.
A Dance of Swords is the final level that Ayami faces. There's no change coming from Rin's last chapter, but there is an outcome which affects the next level depending on how you fare here. Ayame is to infiltrate the Kuroya's lair, where Ogin has been captured, and free her. It's not Temurai's fortress or Meio's lair, it's more like an estate that's been mildly designed to give the impression of a larger fortress. The front area has a couple of gullies that lead to what acts as the outer bailey of the lair. There are a few nice touches here. The guard atop the lookout spot stops you from using the walls to get the drop on the other guards, and their intersecting patrols make it difficult to isolate them. If you approach it from the right, you can find some high ground and pick your moments from there. Whether you choose to even engage with the guards, your infiltration point to the heart of the estate is through a sewer. Your destination is the large house in the short distance, around which are clutches of guards. However difficult you want to make this section is largely up to you. The small house provides enough elevation that you're able to make it through largely unmolested, but, killing stuff or watching a guard try in vain to jump into a wall is always worth it. The two pathways offered to you don't make a world of difference, but upon entering the building, you'll soon discover it's a playhouse. There are a sporadic number of geisha roaming the area. It's just a shame that the indoor location with its rafters weren't utilised a little more, but the main focus is taking centre stage. Ayame discovers Ogin, who's busy being skewered by Ranzo. Managing to break up the show, Ayame now has to contend with dishing out a bit of pain. The fight with Ranzo is essentially on a timer. It's around 2.5 minutes, I think. Depending on whether you defeat Ranzo in this time affects which particular mission serves as Rin's final level. Make no mistake, Ranzo is tough. He's quick, got range, as well as an ability that can paralyze you. Trying to raw dog him, as it were, without using items, is extremely difficult, at least on Fatal Shadow's hardest difficulty. Whipping a few grenades or other items at him is a viable strategy, however the quote-unquote best approach is with the Docto Blades. Just as when you get poisoned you'll convulse and have your attacks interrupted, so too will your opponent when they've been infected. Using this method you can all but trivialize the fight. It's night and day compared to trying to play this fair. Either you kill Ranzo and he bleeds out on the stage, or he ends up getting bored and peacing out. The result is still the same. Ogin is saved. Ayame is kind enough to unskewer her from the wall before taking her leave too. And that, for better or worse, is Ayame's final mission. It's Rin's story after all, and Juzo is still out there.
Light, darkness, and the haze of dreams. Tenchu, fatal shadows. Evil will perish in a flash of crimson.
So this is what Fatal Shadows has been building towards, the final showdown with Juzo. Depending on if you defeat Ranzo or not, you're either playing Fatal Shadows or Kurenai. The latter is the Japanese name of Fatal Shadows, meaning crimson. The only material difference, save for enemy layouts, is that in the Fatal Shadows version, you must contact Manjiro before you can head to the final showdown with Juzo. As a final level, just like we said about Ayame, it's no assault on Mayo or Tenrai's fortresses, nor do we have the grandeur of a sea battle like Birth of the Stealth Assassins. Befitting of the budget and the narrative, it is a much more muted affair. Rin finds herself in a downtown area, much like a number of the urban levels we've been to before. There are a couple of varying pathways which will all eventually lead to your destination. It's up to you how difficult you want to make the approach to Hito Beach. With the benefit of hindsight for what's coming up, you'd be forgiven for brute forcing the majority of this mission. Enemies are dense and sport some nice placements, particularly at the level's midpoint, where there are 2 sets of scaffolding with guards patrolling each. Also worth a shout out is the section in some sort of lumberyard that would take a ton of trial and error if you weren't willing to literally throw everything you've got at the problem. If there ever was a situation that was crying out for the invisibility spell, this is it. Playing Fatal Shadows and hearing reviews and comments online talking about the difficulty, I can't help but be reminded of the criticism Dark Souls 2 received on its release. To boil it down pretty tritely, it amounted to simply adding more enemies made it difficult, an enhancement that on the surface seems rather uninspired. I'm not exactly a huge Dark Souls 2 fan or fan of the series in general, though Sekiro is unsurprisingly one of my favourite games. I can't possibly articulate the arguments for and against Dark Souls 2. However, I'll say in Fatal Shadows' case, the placements are well thought out and there are nuances to their behaviour. I never felt enemies were densely packed in for the sake of it. If they were, then you wouldn't be able to bide your time and deal with them with the skills on hand. I was never in a position where it was impossible. You don't have to slaughter everyone, there's a choice. The skills you learn, the more proficient a player you become, the items you bring with you, all contribute to your decisions. Putting the pieces together and honing your timing in order to solve a difficult situation is its own reward, and Fatal Shadows excels at that above all else. Unfortunately, with the good, we also have the bad, the very bad. Once you've cleared out the enemies from the area or avoided them, you can find Manjiro cowering in a corner. He points you towards the coast, Hitowa Beach. Stepping out onto the sand, you won't find Juzo, but a man playing the shamisen, Sho. He's none too pleased that Rin isn't in the mood for his tunes and turns his axe into a rifle. An annoying battle, but not an impossible one. Like Futaba, Sho prefers to be at range and shoot rather than fight hand to hand. Despite Rin's pitiful range, she can make short work of him by strafing and picking her moments. Bit of an anticlimax if Sho were our final fight, but of course that's not how the story ends. Juzo will appear and let Sho gaze upon his reflection one last time before he does the deed himself. As is kind of traditional in the final levels of the game, we did have the sub-boss before the grand finale. Unfortunately, or actually rather fortunately, Sho is no Onikage
Now, that was entertaining.
in all his forms. Just before tangling with Juzo, there's time for a revelation or two. Juzo is or was Rin's fiancé, though it was arranged by the village elders. The girl was not on board with the idea, not that it would have come to fruition anyway. Juzo and the rest of the courier had grown tired of the Hagakure long before the sound of wedding bells started chiming. For Juzo, living only to perform the bidding of old men was no way to exist. He'd rather forge his own path, live and die by his own decisions. But the Hagakure would never allow Juzo and the others to leave. They'd be disavowed, which meant death. Striking before the elders had a chance, what Ayame stumbled into in the village that night was the execution of that escape plan. However ironic or hypocritical it may be to take dozens of lives so that you may have your own, it's through Juzo's newfound free will that he is here, face to face with Rin. Juzo offers Rin a final choice, to join the ranks of the courier, which means bearing Juzo's child. With a baby inside her, chances are Rin will forget the slaughter of her friends and family. Time heals all wounds and that. Of course, it's an offer she's not willing to accept. As Rin of the Benia, she has been tasked with killing Juzo. She aims to make good on that contract. So now we enter the biggest load of bullshit in the entire game. Jesus Christ, this battle. Let's begin with the most obvious elements. Juzo has more range than Rin. Let's be honest, a T-Rex in a slap fight has more range. This obviously makes it difficult to approach him because you need to move into range in order for your hitbox to connect. So just wait for him to come to you then. Problematic. Like a lot of the bosses, their grab range is insane. Yeah, you can break grabs, but call it a skill issue, but that hardly ever worked. Juzo also has an unblockable attack that he likes to phase into while you're attacking him, so you've got no time to evade. If you do evade the attack, good luck running in after him to try and get a string off, not to mention all his moves feel like they have priority too. His thrust attack basically has zero charge up. To add insult to repeated injury, the game's lock-on system is a lie. It's difficult to describe, but it's not a persistent lock-on. What I mean is, once you've locked on, no matter where the character moves or how you move, as you move in or attack, those actions should target the object you're locked onto. The way it works in Fatal Shadows is more like a temporary lock-on. If you or the character moves too much and then attacks, you'll attack where they were and not where they are. This makes actions like evading pointless. You never hit the character, you're best off avoiding it entirely. The issues with the lock-on and range are ones that have persisted since Wrath of Heaven. The fact that they have not been properly remedied is inexcusable. It's nothing that's going to get someone put on trial in The Hague, but I would love it if a developer or designer, hell anyone from K2, were to completely raw dog this fight. A couple of health potions, but that's it. Admittedly, I am not the best at the game's combat side, but I am far from poor. Even if you check out people's playthroughs on YouTube, this fight is absolutely no pushover. There's a line between challenging and broken. The Juzo fight is busted. I'm not ashamed to say I broke out the save states for this one. I even tried to cheese him around environmental objects like the rock in a car. He puts Tenrai and Mayo's bullshit to shame. I would have had a meltdown after playing through the level only to get bodied by Juzo at the end of it. On my first playthrough, I must have spent a good half an hour figuring out the best way to defeat him. But my second time through, I came prepared, and it was night and day. Thanks to Swift Shark's tips on game facts for this one, just bring some caltrops, it's like the only time you'd use them, and 2 of Teshu's bamboo guns. Using this method just melts Juzo. It's not even funny. Maybe it's me, maybe it's just too much of a skill issue. If I'm going down on a sinking ship screaming that K2's combat system, while fun, has some major flaws, then so be it. When you finally manage to land the killing blow, in my case elbowing Juzo in the nuts so hard his neck exploded, we're afforded a little more context on the one-eyed man's motivations. Not content with the caste system the Hagakure, and by extension of the ninja samurai and society as a whole had at that time, Juzo would rather carve his own path. He also gets one of the most badass lines in the entire series.
I shall walk by the light of the sun, and the land shall be covered in the darkness of my shadow.
Quite sinister. It's clear he's not going to take up farming, but somehow use the courier as implements to shape the world to his liking. Perhaps if he had not betrayed the village and married Rin, events would have transpired differently. Now, Juzo's face down in the sand, coming to terms with his decisions. I'm still not 100% sure if the flower is an edelweiss or a lily, but it represents the Hagakure village and therefore Rin's normal life. His lack of an eye has left him metaphorically and physically blind. Whether he misses Rin on purpose, we'll never know. Either way, Rin has no intention of being the one to put him out of his misery too quickly. Along with some nice cinematography, a final shot lingers on that of the flower and the kitsune mask. Leaving the former behind, it's clear Rin has made the choice about the path she'll walk. The path happens to be laden with the remaining members of the Kuroya who want her dead. Fortunately, she has some backup in the form of Ayame. The two will cut through more Kuroya henchmen. Juzo literally had an army of these dudes, including Ranzo, if he didn't happen to kill him. Technically, there are two endings in the game, though saying that feels rather strong. One ending shows a mysterious hand gripping Ayame's shoulder. I'm not sure who this is supposed to be. It may not even be someone at all. You could hazard a guess at Onikage, Tatsumaru even. I'd like to think of it more as a portent of the events to come in Wrath of Heaven. The hand is an omen. Ayame needs to keep her guard up. After putting down a fair few, Ayame and Rin exchange a few words before bidding each other goodbye. Even as more enemies rush towards her, amongst the swell of Benio voices, Rin's finally home. And that is the game. If we take a step back and examine the narrative from a foundational level, being an interlude of sorts, it's much higher in scope. We're not defeating a supernatural being, preventing an army from rising up and taking over the land. Rin's story is a personal, smaller tale woven into the fabric of the land of Goda. A footnote, Ayame is little more than a peripheral character, used as a mirror to reflect one side of the internal conflict Rin's battling. Ayame is the confident ninja who knows her place in the world. Her conviction is strong, her will unbending. If only Rin knew of the ninja Ayame once was. Kind of a missed opportunity there. A Tale of Revenge, in fitting with the Jiraigeki vibes, offers a more compact setting to stage the game. However, similar to the previous games, that stage ends up being a little too crowded. There's just not enough game here to allow the characters to breathe, be that Rin, Ayame, Juzo, or the rest of the antagonists. Way back in, I want to say, my Stealth Assassins retrospective, I talked about characters with limited stage time. It's extremely difficult to make them memorable while keeping them in a more grounded story. Onikage, that mad pirate, the giant priest of the fan, they're fine because they're quirky. They look unique, spout off their lines and then die. They're not set up for anything more. When we're introduced to Juzo and his rogues gallery, they look cool. The few lines and manner in which they inhabit the space economically conveys their character. I want to know more about their relationship with the Kuroya and why they joined Juzo. Are they blindly following him? On the surface, we can assume that Futaba holds a candle for Juzo. Shinogi and Ranzo are two sadomasochistic sides of the same coin. Hitoa was probably just following his sister. As for the geisha and shamisen player, Juzo probably had them down bad. You can infer these things, which is a credit to the writing and direction. There's just very little beyond it. In the type of Chanbara structure hell in a ton of works, you have faceless cool henchmen that are there to serve as an obstacle to a goal and nothing more. It's exemplified in films like the Lone Wolf and Cub series. It works there because they are rarely tied into the greater narrative. They'll just appear on the road or in a desert, draw the sword, and the audience understands it's time for a showdown. Likewise, in this respect, Fatal Shadows also mirrors Ninja Scroll in its colourful cast of fleshy barriers to the boss. Ninja Scroll works so well because the narrative focus is on Jubei and Kagero's relationship. Despite the change in medium, Genma, the big bad of Ninja Scroll, has memorable henchmen. Their appearance, brief time you spend with them, and the way the battles play out all contribute to this. Fatal Shadows does not have that luxury. The areas which do receive more narrative focus is on Rin and Juzo's story. Ayame doesn't really grow or change particularly during the game. She doesn't need to. Rin and Juzo act as parallels. The destruction of the Hagakure village is the catalyst that puts Rin on a journey of self-discovery, while its raising was the direct result of Juzo having come to terms with the path he aims to walk. While Rin wrestles with the decisions of remaining a true assassin or pursuing another life, Juzo's conviction does not waver. Those that he sacrifices in pursuit of that goal, lovers or comrades, are necessary foundations to build his dream. It's fitting that Juzo only doubts himself at the very end, bleeding out on a beach moments after Rin has chosen her path. I spoke a while back about Hagakure, the book by Yamamoto Tsunetomo. Juzo's reason for leaving the Hagakure is rejecting the samurai class and the caste system in general. However, what both Rin and Juzo share in common by the end of the game is a willingness to die, not for one's lady or lord, but for what they believe in. The impression we get from Fatal Shadow's antagonist is that Despite him chucking a good few characters under the bus, he still had a soft spot for Rin, and even Ayame to some degree. He's not a senseless killer, nor does he wish to provoke Goda. Just yet, anyway. In terms of him as a character within the context of the other entries in the series, Juzo is head and shoulders above the rest. I do have a soft spot for Kagami from Birth of the Stealth Assassins, but Juzo is clearly the best written. Rin, on the other hand, just doesn't get enough time to cook. As a character, she plays well off Ayame if you've played the previous games, knowing the kind of impetuous and emotion-driven character she once was. It's a shame that side doesn't play into the story. Rin's choices, being a killer or assassin, or however you want to dress up taking someone's life, or just living what would pass for a normal life, offer a larger question. What will you do with your freedom? From the rigidity of life in a ninja village to basically anything is overwhelming, it's understandable there's a pull to a facsimile of that familiar routine as opposed to anything else. That's a lot of choices. With no one as a confidant aside from Ayame, it's natural Rin reaches out to the woman as flotsam to cling to. But the truth is, no one's prepared to spell it out for Rin. Despite Kichigoro telling Rin she's not made for this line of work, despite us racking up a kill count that had put Genghis Khan to shame, she ultimately chooses to join the Benia. Whether you believe that's a fitting ending or not is up to you. We're creatures of habit, we cling to the familiar, and that familiar is cutting dudes up. It was always going to be a challenge in any game where assassinating is the main thrust to tell a story about not knowing whether you're a killer or not. But I'm more than happy to shove the dissonance aside and meet Fatal Shadows on its terms. I would have liked to have seen a reality where it was able to become an actual mainline entry into the series instead of technologically and narratively being sandwiched in between a few entries. Skills, I'd say, make a welcome return in Fatal Shadows, but like the divergent pathways, they're bogged down by being utilised as a tool to drag out playtime. If you're going through the campaigns once with each ninja, assassinating everybody, getting a few choice kills in there, and doing it all on the highest difficulty, chances are you'll make it about halfway through the unlockables, maybe 200 scrolls. You need 550 scrolls to unlock the very final move, a Wrath of Heaven type move. Technically, you could do another run through the game and a bit extra and make it out with everything. That's not the issue I have here. There's just not enough cool stuff you're unlocking to keep you forging forwards, wondering what the next interesting ability is, waiting behind a few more scrolls. Abilities like Cling to Ceiling are all around 400 scrolls, which you're not getting without being deep into multiple playthroughs. That should have been way earlier. Cling to Ceiling actually has much better utility this time around because guards will cross paths, leaving you no place to hide. Instead, you're unlocking Arrow Block, which is too circumstantial and should have been combined with the perfect parry, and Wall Run. On the surface, Wall Run sounds awesome. We're gonna go all Ninja Gaiden up in this piece. Instead, it's a move with next to no utility. It doesn't allow you to do anything the grappling hook does, and scenarios don't exist to provide it with utility. Hawkeye, which used to be great to combine with the blow dart, is rendered mostly useless because of the restrictive draw distance. Numbing Strike on Mind Control just delays the time to execute an enemy unless you're going for a pacifist run. But there are a lot of cool and overpowered techniques at your disposal. The sniper ability turns your shurikens into a one-shot if you strike the enemy in the dome. Shadow gives Rin the invisibility scroll. Like Tenchu, she can also learn the decoy whistle as an ability to calm down guards. A shame that her final grab attack is pretty trash because it's extremely difficult to grab bosses. You're best off just attacking them for the same damage. Ayame suffers from the same problem too, unfortunately. Cheetah Sprint, which allows Ayame to Naruto run over a short distance, is useful for bridging tight gaps between enemy patrols. Inner Ear allows Ayame to sense nearby enemies, which is generally useful with tricky enemy positions. False Wall drags up some wallpaper and obscures you from the enemy. It functions as an easier version in some cases of Cling to Ceiling because there's no time limit on the move. Her special move, Wrath, which the lore explains is not as powerful as it would be, can side through several enemies at a time. Again, if you're not planning on attacking multiple enemies in one go, and why would you, its use varies. My issues with the skills are twofold. One, they arrive too late in the game. You can justify this by saying that moves are too powerful. You are right, Invisible Debater, a couple are, and I'll say what I said in my Wrath of Heaven video. If you implement a charge or skill point system in order to utilize these moves, you can allow the player to access them earlier. Instead of gaining access to skills later in the game, you're instead gaining more charges or uses of the move. That makes it easier, and you still have an assortment of engaging tools for the player by the end of the first playthrough. Wrath of Heaven did allow you to unlock all skills if you cleared each mission on Grandmaster. Here, it's not the case. It's another shame because K2 were taking the skills in the right direction by focusing on tools that expand a player's options while on the hunt. In the end, I'm guessing some people never even got to play with them. There are a couple of extra modes waiting for you outside of the story mode. Of course, you've got your level select, which allows you to play missions as either Rin or Ayame to grind scrolls or just experience what a mission's like with another character. The tutorial, rather than a mode in itself, is a definite step up from Wrath of Heaven, which was purely text-based. You can get to grips with the core mechanics. If you've played Wrath of Heaven, most can be skipped. The boss battle mode is pretty self-explanatory. If you fancy getting extremely angry in record time, just load up the Juzo fight and you'll be good. Aside from that, you can practice boss strats if you were planning on doing a specific playthrough. Don't know why you would. I think a no damage run of the game is definitely possible if you stuck with Caltrops and the Bamboo Gun for Rin and a combo of the Smoke Bomb and Doctor Blades for Ayame. An interesting addition to Fatal Shadows is the Red Blade mode, basically your boss rush mode of sorts. The majority of missions are a score attack mode in which you're required to survive for a set amount of time killing enemies and beating a high score. It's not particularly difficult. Enemies can be cheesed in larger arenas and are generally quite weak. It all functions as a prelude to the final mission. This is the true boss rush. You begin with 3 minutes on the clock. Each time you defeat a boss, you receive additional time. Obviously, as enemies become more difficult, they take more time, so you're best defeating weaker enemies quicker so that you have a reserve of it for harder opponents. I found this mode comparatively easier with Ayame. She's got better range than Rin and her speed really comes in clutch. 5 healing potions are all you get, no other items, and you will want those potions to last. The environment itself can be used a little to your advantage. Some geometry like the lantern and steps can help you out in a pinch. Ultimately, it's your command of the game's combat system that will see you come out on top. It goes without saying that out of all your foes, Juzo will absolutely be the toughest opponent. I tried this mode a few times, gradually going through my potions, then this dude would come in at the end and absolutely body me. But what are your rewards if you conquer it? Your mileage may vary, but I thought they were pretty cool. Retro costumes from the previous games. Seeing Ayame in her Tenchu 2 outfit was a nostalgic hit, and Rin's alternate costume was a nice addition. Is it worth the stress of the mode? I'll leave that one up to you. What stays with me most at the end of Fatal Shadows is this nagging sense of what could have been. What would have happened if this had just been released on the PSP? How would that have tempered or skewed expectations? Would this have even worked as a fully fledged entry? And if so, was there even a budget there to match its ambitions? Fatal Shadows' fingers brush against solid ideas, themes and designs, but in its current form, it could never quite get a solid grip. It has maturity and focus in its storytelling, edges closer to understanding what makes its brand of fast-paced arcadey stealth fun, but falls short in its presentation and controls. These what-ifs leave me a little chagrined when we see what came next. Time of the Assassins for PSP, Tenchu Z for the Xbox 360. Not bad games by any means, but just as flawed. You can see the incremental progress, but frustratingly, K2 never quite managed to reach its potential. Maybe we'll never know what truly happened with this game's development. Maybe I'm totally off the mark in my assumptions, but ultimately it cost them time, money, and more importantly, reputation. Despite its positives, Fatal Shadows did more harm than good to the Tenchu brand, damage which to this day it's still not recovered from. I've said it before, but FromSoft has the IP. Elden Ring, Dark Souls, and whatever they're working on next will undoubtedly give the company a lot of financial freedom to experiment. They brought back Armored Core, so a part of me is holding out hope that one day the Tenchu franchise will see a similar revival. Thanks for watching.